I have this argument, or not argument, debate quite often as well, that Bitcoin isn't a hedge against inflation. So, well, no, it's not. It's a hedge against currency debasement.
Debasement,
but
right. That's
more
right.
concretely, and this is a hill I'll die on, stand back, Bitcoin is a hedge against crazy.
Yeah.
It's a hedge against crazy.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of crazy out there at the moment in developed as well as developing economies.
Totally.
And for me personally, this is not investment advice, for me personally, that's what Bitcoin is. It's a hedge against crazy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are here with the prolific Noelle Acheson. She's coming to us, I believe, live from Madrid, if I'm not mistaken. I have been following Noelle's work for a while. It's an honor to have her here with us today. You'll usually see her on channels like Real Vision, or I think she was just on Scott Melker's channel, The Wolf of Wall Street. So we were just speaking before. I thanked her for coming on what is kind of a startup podcast here. And I have lots of questions for her, but before I'll introduce her a bit. She used to be the head of research at CoinDesk and at research CoinDesk and Genesis Trading. And if I could ask you to introduce yourself, and I'm also just curious if you could include in that introduction your educational background and then even what you were doing before CoinDesk and Genesis, if you don't mind.
Of course, Frank. And how long have you got? But first of all, I do want to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's a total honor to be here with you today. And I really love the focus that you have brought to your podcast, the Bitcoin centric, which is dear to my heart and my origins in this industry, but also the global outlook that you are trying to introduce more into the Western canon, as it were. I'm totally behind that, as you can imagine. Some very brief background. I was born in Zambia, spent most of my childhood there. And that it was influential into why I ended up falling down this rabbit hole. But then moved around to a lot of different continents throughout most of my life, studied in the US and ended up going straight into traditional finance. I had a degree in applied maths and economics, and it just seemed like the most productive thing to do after all that suffering, right?
Sure.
So worked in the city of London for a while, ended up in Toronto, corporate finance, equity research. I was a broker for a while, God help me. I ended up doing fund management in Spain. And then I, fell in love, got married, had a child. And what I was doing at the time was just not compatible with things like, breathing, because I was trying to manage futures and options. I have just blocked all of that out of my memory.
Sure.
I ran a startup, an e-commerce startup, founded and ran an e-commerce startup here for 13 years, one of the early e-commerce companies in Spain, because Spain is, quite a few years behind most of the United States, for sure. And then I sold that in 2013, tried to figure out what next to do, what's my next career going to be. Decided to take some time off to recover my brain, because total burnout, flatlining, and was reading. I remember I was reading in my parents' living room over Christmas 2013 to 2014, January 2014. I'm sitting in their living room, and I keep hearing about this thing called Bitcoin. I was looking into what had been happening in technology when I wasn't paying attention, finance as well. And Bitcoin kept coming up. I don't like not understanding things. So I dug up a video online, Khan Academy. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Sure. And I got goosebumps after just understanding that what I was looking at was permissionless payments. And because I grew up in Africa, I just thinking what it could do in that part of the world. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. This was back in early 2014. And we all know that the barriers that got thrown in the idea's way and the complications and the resistance from traditional finance as well. But the more I dug, the more I got interested, you know how you can tell the quality of a person by his or her enemies, right? I do feel you can tell the quality of an idea by the type of enemies it awakens. And the more that was thrown in Bitcoin's development's way, the more interested I got.
That is beautifully put. I've had that thought, but never articulated it so perfectly. That's a great way to put it. It's very interesting to see who dislikes Bitcoin and then the reasons why they dislike it. It's quite fascinating.
Exactly.
Thank you for all that background. I actually did not know that you were born in Zambia. That's fascinating. Sort of makes a lot more sense as to why you've written about Bitcoin and crypto and its adoption in the global south or developing countries. I don't particularly love either term, but I don't know what the best term to use is. So, um,
Similar to you as well, Frank. You spent quite a lot of time in Africa as well.
yeah, it's I think one of the things that I learned from being in Africa, from I was in Ghana and Namibia primarily, but went to Togo for a little bit and South Africa, is I actually felt so useless there. People were so good with their hands, so entrepreneurial, so sharp. And it was like often what I noticed was they just either didn't have access to capital or didn't have access to good capital. Their capital was currently being debased or something like that. And so when I originally found Bitcoin 2000, it was towards the end of the 2017 cycle when I started to understand it. I did think about some of the people that I worked with, especially in Ghana, because I was in a rural area there. I think banking services were not as readily available to people. But I also, and I still struggle with this, is I don't want to be the white foreigner imposing a new sort of currency, magic internet money on people. So I've actually spoken with people in Ghana, and we'll be going back to the village I used to live in with some native Ghanaian people to start teaching them about Bitcoin with local people, because I just feel like that's necessary because I see the value in it. I don't necessarily think everyone else will see it immediately. Hence also the reason I do this podcast, to try to explain it to people. But that's a story for a different day. I will leave it
That's
there.
amazing.
I'll leave it there for now.
That's seriously amazing. And
Thank you.
if only there were more people like you who are willing to put in the time and the effort and bring their experience to the table. Because I totally agree with you. We can't really have people from totally different cultures and backgrounds dictating to Africa what they should or shouldn't do with their payment systems. I mean, this has been one of the problems of development in the continent for centuries.
Forever.
People from outside, and it still is today, arguably, people from outside telling them how they should evolve. But it's just as we don't want entrepreneurs in developing economies to totally ignore the experience of those from outside. So the kind of thing that you're proposing, which is the hybrid solution, sounds ideal.
I do hope it works. I felt very lucky. I actually found randomly, it was someone named Kumina Kansa. He runs a group called the Bitcoin Cowries. They're helping to develop two different circular economies in Ghana. And I interviewed him. I think he was my second guest on this podcast, but he was like, "Oh, I'm in the Volta region of Ghana teaching people about Bitcoin." And I know I lived in the Volta region, but I had never seen the word Volta region or the words Volta region and Bitcoin together. I'm like, okay, this is the person who I need to connect with. And he's specifically focusing on education. So I lucked out in that regard. So yeah, I think that's the fun part of this podcast. It's a bit of a journey. So I've been getting to meet people, have conversations with people who I think each conversation thus far has had a sort of a deep impact on my life. It has made me think about things differently. And I've sort of begun to develop relationships with people in, obviously in Ghana, but also now in Namibia and some of the other countries where I've spoken with people. I'll be working with Lorraine Marcel, who started Bitcoin Dada in Kenya. I used to be a teacher, a college lecturer, and a K through 12 teacher. I used to work with immigrants here in the States as their like a ESL and writing teacher. And I'll be starting to do some Bitcoin education stuff as well. So it's been great that this has been an opportunity, like I said, to develop relationships and to hopefully make a bit more of an impact on the ground. So, but you're far more interesting than I am, so I want to stick to you before we go over here.
Beg to differ. Totally beg to differ. And and everything that you're talking about, Frank. I mean, not only your journey so far, but what you're focusing on doing now. I mean, to talk about bringing meaning to the table, it matters.
100%, and I think it's hard to explain it to everyone, but I don't think I've ever felt so much purpose in something like the
And that's
sense
a luxury, isn't it?
Totally a luxury. Absolutely. So it's a fascinating intersection of so many worlds and interests. I mean, inherently something like Bitcoin is that Bitcoin or crypto. So being able to pursue that, whether or not it brings in a huge amount of income right now or not, is truly a gift, and I treat it as such. Yeah.
Absolutely. And haven't you also found, Frank, I know we'll get on to things that you want to talk
That's
about.
okay.
We're getting
That's
off track
okay.
here, but already we're getting off track.
Yeah.
This is a good start. But haven't you found that in your experience has been very wide and varied, as has mine. But in this industry, in the crypto industry, you meet the most
The
interesting
most
people,
interesting people, yes.
because we're
Yes.
coming at it from different angles. And I think we all meet a lot of people who are just in it for the money as well. But
Yep.
most of the people we meet, especially the parts that you and I focus on, they care about change.
Yes.
We don't know what change is going to look like or where the world will be 50 years from now. But we're here to try to make it as productive and profitable for people, profitable in all holistic sense of the word, as possible. All of
Totally.
us, we care about change, and that is the most hopeful thing that I've seen. Things can get really bleak out there, but if you have talented, passionate people working to make the world a better place, to help channel this change in productive directions, then that is the most hopeful thing going on at the moment.
I could not agree more. I think so much of the world, from you could name any sort of sad topic, from climate change to what's going on with currency debasement around the world, all this stuff. It's very easy to get wrapped up and to be saddened by what's happening in the world. And I think that, again, sometimes people will sort of scoff at this, but when I say something like Bitcoin is hope, I mean it with my whole heart. I think it's incredibly important to people. And then the broader crypto ecosystem, something like stablecoins as hope, another way to hedge against currency debasement in countries. I think that this is important, but especially I think amongst, you know, Bitcoin culture, the concept of being a Bitcoiner, it's something that transcends national, these state lines or national lines. And I think that people want to help the network survive and the people on the network thrive. And so there's this thing now of, I used to teach as a, I used to teach a guy named Robert Putnam who talked a lot about the concept of diversity. He was a what was his name? I'm sorry, what was his job? I think he was a political scientist at Harvard. And he said, diversity in the short term can actually cause some sort of conflict because we have these in-group, out-group biases. But he said in the long term, it's really a great thing because we get more diversity of thought, more ideas, all this stuff. And he said, one of the things that you need for diversity to work is something that people have in common outside of whether it's their gender, their heritage, their race, their whatever it is. So this idea of Bitcoin being this thing that now so many people from all over the planet have in common and are working towards, it's like it's one of the most powerful forces. And it might, I'll say this with, take it with a grain of salt as like a white straight male saying this, but I do believe it even has the power to do stuff like reduce racism, reduce sexism, and I think it's because if you can look at someone under this other blanket term, whether you call yourself a Bitcoiner or a Bitcoin enthusiast, whatever it is, it's a really powerful force for like I'm on this person's side, and I think that's we should be on all people's sides. I get that, but people do need these things to have in common and bond over, and I think it has the power to do that as well, and that's what also excites me on the social level. But and I won't get into this. I won't have you get me into this part of it too. But the first thing I thought about when I first understood this was the social impacts of it. The night I found out about it, we were talking. I was in the music business before I went into teaching, and I came from a very bottom up sort of thing. I was very the DIY music scene, bands making their own music, putting out their own records, making their own flyers. And I was like, wait, all these developers are just working together in a sort of community. And I was like, oh, I saw this with independent music, people booking their own shows. And so I saw it from this sort of community sense before I saw it from a financial sense at all. I actually went back and did part of my MBA after I learned what Bitcoin was. And so I think it's this idea. I'm seeing some of these trends play out, people from all over all over the world working together, learning from one another. To me, it's so magical. And I think the small part I would like to play is for the people who don't really get it, people who I used to actually like as politicians, like take Elizabeth Warren, for example, who don't really get it. I really want them to see this other side of it. I want them to see the sort of unity that it brings about, the cooperation. I can get frustrated. I get frustrated. Yeah, let's leave it there. But I do think it's an important part of the story to tell. And not only that, I think people like yourself sharing the vast amount of knowledge you have, and it's for free. It's on YouTube, it's on podcasts, you do it yourself, you write a newsletter, you write for CoinDesk, all this stuff. And I think I think people underestimate that sort of power. I mean, the democratization of this knowledge. The world has never seen something like this. We've never had so much knowledge at our fingertips. So if you're an autodidact and you're interested in this stuff, it's so easy to absorb it and then start teaching it yourself. It's just such a fascinating time. But I am going to ask you questions now. You're very
Well, teaching is the best way to learn, don't you
totally,
find? I mean, that's
totally,
how I
yes.
learned. I started writing a blog about crypto back in 2014.
Oh
And
wow.
for me, that was just my way of learning. I want to understand how it could influence trade finance. So
Yep.
I learnt and explained as I was going along. And that's what led to working for CoinDesk. And then from CoinDesk, I focused largely on markets. Again, my background is in markets. I am a
Uh,
total markets nerd, but
yeah.
not because I care about price going up or price going down. I don't. And I would make just an absolutely terrible trader for the record. And oh, by the way, nothing I say is ever investment advice. God help me if you think it is.
Yeah.
But markets they're supposed to, Frank, be a tool for freedom.
Yes.
And today they are not.
Yes.
They
Agreed.
should be a marketplace. When I say a marketplace, we all know marketplaces. Marketplaces exist around the world. But when you apply the gated technologies that today's marketplaces have for the exchange of assets, then they end up being exclusionary.
Yes.
You can only afford detailed data if you are rich. You can
That's right.
only buy these innovative kind of investments if you have $2 million in your bank account.
Yep.
That exacerbates inequality, which in my opinion is the biggest threat to democracy. So for
Yes.
me, marketplaces are not only an equalizer, they are one of the pillars of democracy, and they've gone off the rails somewhat, which is
Agreed.
why I very much care about the impact that crypto technologies and crypto assets will have on marketplaces around the world. Imagine if they were easy to spring up. Imagine if they could facilitate greater transparency and fluidity and liquidity anywhere. Just imagine what that could do to local economies as well as national economies, as well as new geopolitical alliances. It's
Yep.
a fascinating field, and I forget how I even got onto this thread.
It's
Apologies for
it's a
that. That's
perfect
probably how
segue. No,
that's how this conversation is probably going to go, right?
no, it's a perfect segue because the first question I had scripted for you is why is crypto macro? What you say your newsletter is called Crypto is Macro or Crypto is Macro now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're someone who has a lot of experience in traditional markets. Why is crypto macro now? And then I guess I'll just add this on now. Why is crypto macro versus why is not just Bitcoin macro? So I just to put them both out there. Yeah.
That's a great question, and again, I'll ask: how long do we have?
Yeah.
I could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Um, the point that I wanted to make with that title and the focus of the newsletter is about not just the impact of the macroeconomy on crypto markets. I focused on this a lot when I was running research at Genesis Trading. It's tuning into all of the Federal Reserve press conferences, reading the economics data like they were tea leaves, trying to figure out what are investors going to do now and what's that going to do for the price, because that was the market that Genesis Trading was focusing on. But underlying all of that, I was always fascinated by why this matters. We can tell a good story now about why the Bitcoin's price was driven largely by macro liquidity concerns and
Yep.
why Bitcoin investors do care very much about rates expectations and what the CME is up to.
Yep.
But for me, and that is important, because while it's not about price go up, when the price is going up, that does make it easier for innovative projects that are boots on the ground to get funding. It brings
Yes.
money into the ecosystem, and that's not a bad thing. So,
Sure.
but beyond that, I've thought for a long time now that we are very much overlooking the impact that the crypto ecosystem is having on the macroeconomy,
Mm-hmm.
in the other direction. And by that, I mean it's not just about macro investors making room in their portfolios for this alternative asset. It's much bigger than that.
Yep.
It's a new tool in the box when it comes to financial independence. I'll come back to that in a second, but I'll
Mm-hmm.
continue down the list. It's about energy politics.
Yep.
We've often heard about, and this is true, how Bitcoin can finance the construction of grids in remote places, and just think what that could do to local economies. It's about the climate. We know how Bitcoin mining can help purify the atmosphere from some of the carbon emissions coming from fossil fuel production. We know how it can finance production of renewable electricity. We know how it can support grids, et cetera, et cetera. It's also about the role of the dollar. I don't think that crypto assets are going to replace the dollar anytime soon. I don't think anything's going to replace the dollar anytime soon, but inevitably the role of the dollar in global trade is going to diminish. We just need to look at the recent BRICS expansion to see an example of how that's going to happen. Is Bitcoin going to be a global currency for trade? I personally don't think so. But the consequence of shifting the weights of currencies in geopolitics is going to cause significant turmoil in currencies around the world. And we know the hardship that we've seen at firsthand, the hardship that that can impose on some of the developing economies that rely on dollars for their oil, for their sugar, that rely on dollars to be able to finance some of their infrastructure projects. So it's also about developing economies, energy. I think I said that one. There's many more factors of how crypto is influencing macro. I'm not even starting on the whole CBDC conversation, which is also very significant. Asset tokenization is another thing I've been focusing on recently because of the efficiency of markets that we talked about before. But coming back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the financial independence, I believe we're coming up to a big reset in geopolitical alliances, a big reset in how the global economy works. And this is not just shifting trade and military alliances. This is not just dwindling resources in some areas with new types of resources being needed in others. This it's much bigger than that. It's also the growing mistrust in institutions. It's also the increasingly polarized politics. It's a whole lot of things at the same time when we have a different type of communications technologies now. Resets throughout history, they've happened often before. They have always been influenced by the new technologies of the era. And for the first time, Frank, for the very first time, there is a new technology on the scene now, a new tool in the box that is more powerful in the hands of the individual than in the hands of the authorities. We've never had that before. And I don't know what the impact of that is going to be, but I really want to find out.
Yes. Isn't it? Doesn't it feel like such an immensely exciting time to be alive just to document it? Forget about try to predict it or just to document it. Just seems like you're able to tell one of the most unbelievably fascinating stories in human history. And I don't think you think I'm being hyperbolic either as I say that. I just think I look at this as nothing other than one of the most fascinating changes. I was explaining it to someone who doesn't necessarily understand Bitcoin. And I was explaining it as if human beings were constantly maybe caught between the poles of the state and the corporation, sort of like private sector and public world, I would say that Bitcoin and certain crypto assets add a third dimension to this, where you now have three poles. You have the state, you have the corporation, and then you have the individual with these assets. So it adds like a third dimension of power into the mix. And nobody knows what that will look like. Will it all be used for good? Well, one, that's subjective, and two, no, we have no idea what it'll be used for. But it does give power back to the individual in an age where privacy is decreasing and freedoms are decreasing around the globe. And most people don't know, but the majority of the world lives under an authoritarian regime. I think it's 4.3 billion people. So it's this thing of like, what will it do? I don't know. And I think some of the smarter minds in the space when it comes to like the humanitarian side of things, like Alex Gladstein, he doesn't even pretend to know what it's going to do. And he's at the forefront of bringing this message to people. Like, look, you need to look at this asset. He specifically speaks about Bitcoin. But you need to look at this, and I like put stable coins into the mix, which he acknowledges are an important part of the equation because a lot of people, especially in emerging markets, do want stable coins. It's just such a fascinating shift of power. And we don't know how much is going to shift away from the state, corporation, whatever it is, and to people. But we'll see. We'll see. I guess it's, if Metcalfe's law holds true and the earliest adopters gain the most from it, we'll see who those earliest adopters are and what that ends up looking like. I do want to shift over. You wrote a really great piece for CoinDesk on what adoption of Bitcoin and stable coins looks like in the fifth and sixth largest countries in the world by population size, which are respectively, I think, Pakistan and Nigeria. And there is a slight difference. Well, there's a bunch of differences between Bitcoin and stable coins. Bitcoin being completely permissionless, whereas with a stable coin, let's say USDC, Circle, the issuer of USDC, could freeze addresses if it wants to. And you have international institutions that are not excited about stablecoins and Bitcoin, like the IMF and the Financial Action Task Force. As someone that writes about this, does it ever worry you that someone who's maybe holding on to these stablecoins as hope could then have their assets frozen? Yeah, I'll just leave it
Yes,
there.
of
Could then
course.
have yeah, okay.
No, for sure. I mean, definitely. And it would be great if more people understood this. But
Hmm.
bottom line, it's not, I mean, it's just simply how human beings work. We
Yes,
always
yes.
sacrifice resilience for convenience. I mean,
Yeah,
I use Gmail. It's not the safest email
that's right.
program, but it's
That's
so
right.
convenient. We know that Telegram is probably, storing what we write and whatever encryption they promise. And again, we use it. We sacrifice resilience for convenience all the time. And
Yep.
that is obviously something that we see often in crypto as well. It's also why I don't believe crypto will ever replace fiat currencies. Fiat currencies are
Mm,
convenient. We go along to the ATM and we count on our bank, picking up the phone if we're upset about something.
yep.
Convenience is how human beings, we're wired. It conserves energy. We can go back to why we're wired this way, but we are wired for convenience. However, there's an alternative now. And for those that are willing to put in the extra work, they can guarantee greater resilience. I'm talking financial, I'm talking in terms of connecting with others, and talking censorship resistance. There's a lot of different things you can throw into that bucket.
Yeah.
So it obviously it's a concern, but it's not that much of a concern because hopefully people will understand. And stablecoins for me simply are liquidity. It's a way to
Yep.
more easily move assets around. It's also a way for many around the world who can't get dollars but need dollars to get dollars. It's are stablecoins going to be replaced by the central bank versions when they become more more widely spread? Maybe. I personally don't think we're going to see a world full of retail CBDCs. I think there'll be plenty of wholesale CBDCs, and that will
Mm,
add more liquidity to cross-border trade. Not a bad thing. But the retail side, people are starting to wake up to the privacy consideration. There's the danger, Frank, that you and I are in this world, and so we have this echo chamber. We think everyone cares about privacy.
right.
Outside of our little echo chamber, most people don't. But I think, given what's happening out there, given the increasing polarization that we were talking about earlier, given the increasing risk to anyone who finds themselves on the wrong side of an authoritarian government, especially given how some of these authoritarian governments are flip-flopping and can change overnight.
Yep.
I shouldn't laugh, it's terrifying, but
Yep.
it is actually also quite absurd from the top-down point of view. Given how easy it is to find yourselves on the wrong side of the authorities, that
Yep.
kind of resistance is going to be increasingly important as we go through. We're seeing countries block off access to internet because they want to stamp down unrest. And these are countries that have traditionally had a reputation for being relatively democratic
Yep.
for their regions. I'm thinking of Senegal, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
who have been suppressing access to internet during the election times. Gabon did the same thing, slightly different story there.
Mm-hmm.
But we should, caveat, slightly tying in this answer to what we were talking about previously. It's easy to say, oh, how exciting it is that Bitcoin is going to be increasingly accepted as a seizure-resistant, censorship-resistant store of value and payment mechanism. But we also do have to acknowledge that change brings pain.
Yeah.
Change will bring a lot of pain to a lot of people. And one thing we have to be cognizant and sensitive to is that the day that Bitcoin is widely used is going to be a pretty dark day for many.
So could you speak to that a little bit? I have a similar feeling. I used to feel a certain urge to educate because I'm like I wanted many people to understand it as possible, so that maybe if Bitcoin does become widely used, they're not on the other side of that equation. As you just said, it'll be a dark day for many. When you say that, could you elaborate a little bit on what goes through your mind? What does that look like for people who don't understand it if it does become this far more monetized, far more used asset that like as you said, is censorship resistant and is a store of value? Could you
Yep,
expand a teeny
absolutely.
bit?
And
Mm-hmm.
that is a brilliant question and something I think we should all be thinking more about. But if we just project ourselves into a world in which all of us value that seizure resistance, that censorship resistance. We value it because we have had bad experiences
Right.
around those particular features, which many of us consider natural rights. If we have had those threatened at any stage, then we're going to understand the value of an
Yes.
asset that protects us to a certain stage. That's what I mean by saying it's
Yep.
going to be pretty bleak if we
Yep.
all value those aspects of Bitcoin. And it comes down to those of us. I mean, I used to hear this all the time, Frank, when people generally of a certain with white hair and their comfortable offices in the world's financial centers telling us that Bitcoin is irrelevant, Bitcoin is useless, Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. They don't need it.
That's
And
right.
they are unlikely to ever need it.
Yeah.
But for the people that you talk to, some of the people that I've spoken to as well, but especially the worlds that you move in, Frank, they don't see it that way. For them, it is a way to have access to some kind of currency that can help them survive some difficult times.
Yeah.
So it was just last year, a year and a half ago, Frank, that we saw a country invaded in Europe. In Europe. And again, this is something that is very close to home for many, many. We didn't expect it, even though the writing was on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And people are fleeing with what they can carry. And this isn't happening in a faraway land that we can sort of pretend doesn't have anything to do with us. It does. It's on our doorstep.
Yep.
And just imagine if they had been able to take their savings with them. I live in Spain, as you mentioned at the beginning, and I have many Ukrainian friends here, and I had many reaching out to me to say what was my advice on how they could get access to their funds in their bank accounts. And by this stage, many of their families are already at the border, and saying, well, if you don't have Bitcoin, there's really not much you're going to be able to do
Yep.
because access to bank accounts have been cut off. That has since been restored. Many people have been able to get access
Okay.
to their savings, but during the times of utmost uncertainty and fear, that's when it really matters. And we're not ready for that. The education that you're talking about will certainly help, but we do have to be careful about not celebrating when that day comes, because it is going to
Totally.
be scary, even for those of us that have taken measures to prepare. And Frank, going back to how we prefer convenience over resilience, even those of us that believe in Bitcoin as the store of value we know it can be, many of us do still use centralized custodians.
Yep.
And we know that that's pretty risky as well, but custody is just another issue that has yet to be solved to help it go mainstream.
Yep. 100%. Yeah. I think it blew my mind that one of the only pieces I saw on somebody fleeing Ukraine with I think it was a ledger device, was something that Barry Weiss at the Free Press wrote. It really surprised me that nobody else covered that or tried to cover that from any other angle, because there probably were a handful of other people who did understand that. But as you just said, like, most people are not going to be thinking like that there, because I think what most people struggle with is they don't know the difference between, when you think about numbers on a screen, numbers in your bank account. You have to understand that cash in your hand is much different than the numbers, that your bank account shows that you have. That money is, being used to give loans to people. It's not necessarily in that bank account anymore. It's a bearer asset when you're holding it, but not when it's in your bank. And then most people are used to looking at, well, this thing is an asset. It's something I can look at on my Fidelity account or my whatever account. So I just watch it go up and down, and Fidelity custodies it for me. This concept of, no, you actually have to withdraw you have to take the private keys for this thing out of the custody of the centralized custodian and then hold your own private. It's like, I joke about it. One of the first people I ever taught about this was my mom, and she just constantly, when I talk, she sort of like blanks over, and she'll be like, "You don't really think everyone's going to understand this, do you?" Like, and it's said with love. It's not said with like, people are dumb and they should try harder. It's just like, this is going to be very difficult for a lot of people.
Well, let's hope that continues to be difficult for a lot of people, to be honest, because when it's easy for them to understand, it's because they've, lived it. I
That's
used
yeah.
to teach at a business school here in Spain, and I would explain, and often to finance types, and I would explain it to them the following way: with, you work hard for your salary, and it gets directly deposited into your bank account, and you think it's yours. But if you read the small print of your bank account, it's not yours. You're not putting your money into a bank and they're not holding it for you. You're buying a financial product. You
Yes.
have the right to extract it, But the bank could say no. And we
Yes.
have seen many cases when the bank does precisely that. The bank will say no. We all know someone by now who has had their account just closed because of something that looked like suspicious activity.
Yeah.
I could want to send money to my son who, let's say he was building orphanages in Pakistan. The bank wouldn't let me do that because there are terrorists in Pakistan. Well, my son's not a terrorist, but no,
Yeah.
sorry, we can't send any money to Pakistan. So how do it's my money? Nope, sorry, you just can't. You can't do that. So
Wow.
that kind of understanding that it's not your money. I mean, in
Yeah.
Greece, just not that long ago, a European country, European Union, people could not access their savings in their
Yep.
bank accounts because of the corral that the government imposed. They just didn't have the banks didn't have the money.
Yep.
That kind of shock does change people's way of thinking. And sure enough, the obvious traditional answer would be gold. But let's face it, if you are going to invest in gold and hold it at a centralized custodian, same thing.
Same thing.
It's not really yours.
Yeah.
Let's say you buy gold bars, bury them in your backyard. Let's say you have to flee. You can't fit that many gold bars in a rucksack. I haven't tried personally, but I'm told you can't fit that many in a rucksack. And also just the potential for coercion. Men could show up with very big weapons and you give them those gold bars, whereas
Yep.
they don't necessarily know that you have a Bitcoin account and they don't necessarily know how to get the password from you. Okay, there
Right.
are cases of that as well, but it's certainly easier to steal gold.
Yes.
So this kind of scenarios, again, looking what's going on out there, especially given the greater fragmentation, while I do not think we're going to end up having civil wars in the developed countries, it certainly doesn't hurt to contemplate a world in which there is a greater amount of civil unrest. I mean, we've
Yep.
seen the United States come pretty close to that not that
Yep.
long ago. And while in Europe things are relatively peaceful, we are also seeing the rise of the far right. We're
Yep.
seeing the far left are digging their heels in as well. And the riots on the streets of Paris are quieting down for now, but it's probably a temporary measure. And in UK, the days lost to strikes are now at their highest level so far this year than any time since the Thatcher years. These
Wow.
are not happy societies, and we are comfortable. This
Right.
is the astonishing thing.
Mine. As you were talking, and I think some of the more moderate voices in the Bitcoin space have talked about this idea of, look, Bitcoin shouldn't replace fiat or anything like that. It just should serve as a bit of a check on the existing system. And so, do you think that? And I think it was someone on CNBC who said, like, the Fed in the US is trying to restore credibility, and you have to believe that when the subtitle for the Bitcoin standard is like the replacement for central banking, whatever, that they're hearing that, and that might actually be a good thing, in that maybe the value of the dollar has to become something again. Obviously, there's very dangerous dynamics at play, the potential debt spiral that the US is in or moving into right now because of the interest on the debt. But I think the ideal scenario, and this is part of the reason I want to talk to you. You have such a very calm, nuanced way of looking at things, and I think it's such a nice, refreshing voice in this space, because a lot of people tend to be very, all or nothing, like fall of fiat, hyperbitcoinization. It's like, I don't really think you want a Mad Max sort of world. I don't think anybody really wants that. So my ultimate goal is that it does serve as my ultimate vision for it is that it does serve as some sort of check. But the other thing about it is, I think the amount of education and looking into the existing system that Bitcoin has catalyzed, the amount of people who start studying Bitcoin but then start studying macroeconomics, alternative schools of thought like Austrian economics, what is modern monetary theory, how does this hurt? The more people have that knowledge, the more the systems are going to have to sort of think like, oh, people are catching on to what we're doing. We need to be a little bit more careful about either devaluing people's money or financializing everything. So I think that one of the things that often isn't talked about as just a tremendous benefit of Bitcoin is just what it catalyzes in people, especially curious autodidacts, people who love to learn on their own. If you are learning and then sharing that information with people, eventually you're increasing consciousness about something, and the major institutions of our world are going to have to react to that eventually when it starts to hit a more sort of, critical mass of people who understand these things. So
Possibly, possibly. I believe that the Fed, for instance, to pull on that example, the what you first mentioned, they got other things on their mind right now.
Oh, interesting.
They don't really think about Bitcoin. They don't care if Bitcoin's going to try and replace them. It's
Mm,
very much like, that little fly on your shoulder that you can just
mm.
brush off. I don't think they see it as a threat, which is one of its biggest strengths, to be honest. I've had this argument many times, Frank, that as soon as Bitcoin becomes popular, the US is going to ban it. The authorities, the IMF, the G20, they're all going to get together to ban it. And my response has always been, by then it'll be too late. By the time they
Yes,
notice it, it'll be too late. And that's
totally.
where we are now. Right now, they're starting to, well, the SEC is certainly noticing it. I don't think the Federal Reserve is just yet, although Powell does a pretty good job of fielding questions on it. I think he has some canned responses. I don't think he's spent a lot of time on this, nor does
Yeah,
he need to be honest, because
yep.
I don't believe Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar. I do believe Bitcoin is an alternative. I have this argument, or not argument, debate quite often as well, that Bitcoin isn't a hedge against inflation. Well, no, it's not. It's a hedge against currency debasement.
Debasement,
But
right? That's right.
more concretely, and this is a hill I'll die on, stand back, Bitcoin is a hedge against crazy.
Yeah,
It's a hedge
yeah,
against crazy. And
yeah.
there's plenty of crazy out there at the moment in developed as well as developing
Totally.
economies. And for me personally, there's not investment advice. For me personally, that's what Bitcoin is. It's a hedge against crazy.
I love it. I love that. Speaking of, let's go to developed economies. Um, it's always a question I wish people asked you. I want to know what Bitcoin means to people, and Bitcoin and crypto means to people in Spain. You're constantly talking about macro and what's going on in the whole world. When you started talking about Bitcoin, this is a question I ask a lot of my guests. Were you at first nervous to do so because you would think that everyone in your social circle would think you lost your mind, or and then the other side of it is, do you, do
I
you
wear that
think?
as a badge of honor.
Okay, that's fair.
Definitely lost my mind, but yeah, I'm
Love
proud
it.
of it.
That's fair.
Yeah,
But
I did. Yeah, a lot of my friends still think I'm crazy, and then
okay.
the bull run happened, and I would get people calling me and asking me about tokens I'd never even heard of, and
Yeah,
my answer was
right.
always stay away, stay away. But no, the lure of quick gains is irresistible. So yes, people, I'll tell you a story, and I hope my husband doesn't get furious with me for telling this story. But he comes from traditional finance, as do I. But he was steeped in traditional finance much longer than I was, and it took almost a year of dinner table debates for him to get it. And the pushback was often along the lines of, "Yeah, but what backs it?" And my answer was always, "What backs the dollar?"
Yep.
And he'd say, "Well, the army, the GDP." It's like, no, not really. I mean, it's faith that the army will be there, or
Mm,
faith that the US will repay it with a GDP. But look at the numbers. Do you really think that's going to happen? It's
yep.
just pure faith. And when you accept that the dollar is backed by nothing more than faith, it's even on the dollar bill, "In God we trust." When you accept that, and that you understand that faith is what moves money. Coming back to what you said earlier about this new technology helping us, people like you and me, Frank, to understand finance better. I'll go further. I'll say it helps finance types to understand finance better. I worked in traditional finance for many years, as we mentioned at the beginning, and I thought I understood money. Turns out I was conflating money with numbers, and
Mm,
I knew how to move them around. That's really it. It wasn't until I fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole that I understood money. And so this is what I try and teach when I give classes. What even is money?
mm-hmm.
Another way, and again, and my husband is now a total Bitcoiner. He's so excited about the
Oh,
whole thing.
cool.
He gets it. He's out there talking to his finance buddies about
Mm,
Bitcoin, trying to explain it to them as well. And it's when we convert traditional finance types who were resistant to start
yep.
with, we have new tools, new ways of looking at it, new forms of expression that can help many of coming at it from different vectors of life to understand. It's a very powerful concept as well. The decentralization thing. This is another thing that I've struggled with explaining to people, and the most powerful way that I've come across is asking anyone, how do I know you are who you say you are? And
Mm,
they'll say, "I can show you my passport," and I'll say, "Who gave that to you?"
yeah,
Say,
yeah.
"Well, my government gave it to me," and they could take it away. And it's
Mm,
very unlikely that where you are, where I am, where that would happen. We're pretty nice people. There's no reason for them to do that. But when you understand how it works, you can see a path to that happening,
yep.
especially if, as we talked about earlier, you find yourself on the wrong side of the authorities.
Yep. 100%. And we don't know how those rules will change or how quickly those things will change if things do unravel, if systems
Absolutely.
unravel. Yeah.
And I have no idea what the solution to decentralized identity looks like. It's the Holy Grail. We just don't know. It's a tough one to solve.
Yeah.
But that question itself, who gave you your identity, that just highlights
Yeah.
it highlights just how vulnerable we are to
Yep.
being on the right side of the authorities, to
Yep.
having to not getting into trouble. And what terrifies me, Frank, is that when more and more of us choose the "I just don't want to get into trouble" approach, well, that's how we sleepwalk into losing a lot of the rights that we have fought so hard for.
100%. And I think, I don't know whether you've dealt with it. I've dealt with the fear of putting certain thoughts on the internet, putting certain ideas out there, even just ideas about Bitcoin. If the government one day realizes, like, no, we don't want to allow this, and we're going to do everything, we're going to set example by taking action against people who speak publicly about this. It took me about a year. I think the first time I wrote a newsletter was about 2.5 years ago. The anxiety was so bad I didn't sleep that night, but I did feel deep down, I'm like, this needs to be said. And also, I think it needs to be said, like I said, by people like yourself. There needs to be nuance added to this equation, and we need to discuss all sides of things. I'm not just going to like slap a Bitcoin logo on what I do and just say it's here to save us or something, but for people to really understand it. But again, I know that at any time, if the powers that be, you know, march in and say, like, this is done, and if you're talking about it, you're in trouble. I know what I've done. I know that I've made myself a target in a way, and I'm very conscious of that.
Yeah.
I just think that the information being out there is, and this sounds very dramatic, but the information being out there is more important than my personal safety. And that's a decision that I've made when
Yeah,
I went into this.
we choose meaning because we care about freedom. And again,
Yep.
this is our battle, isn't it?
100%. And I know that you have a hard stop, so I want to allow you to tell. Please let the audience know where they can find your work so they could read more. I'm sure they're interested in learning more and reading more now that they've heard you speak. So especially your newsletter, if you could share that information with them before we part ways for today.
That's very kind of you to ask, Frank. Thank you.
My
And
pleasure.
as I
Yes.
was say, I have very much enjoyed this conversation. We could go on for another 2 hours at
Totally,
least, couldn't we?
easily.
If anyone wants to read more about the topic that I've been focusing on, which is the macro influence on the crypto ecosystem, but even something I care even more about, the influence of the crypto ecosystem on the shifting macro economy out there, it's at a Substack newsletter called "Crypto is Macro Now." If you just type it into the Google search bar, you should find it pretty easily. It's a daily newsletter. It's a premium subscription to get in, deep insight into some of the shifts that I'm seeing on the weekday basis, with a free edition that comes out on Saturday with some of the highlights from the week.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Twitter, are you on Nostr as well?
I'm not on Austria yet. That is something I definitely need to get around to doing. I barely have enough time for Twitter
I
as
know.
it is, but you can find me at Noelle in Madrid on X, as it is now called. I really
Yes.
hate that name, but anyway,
Yep.
where I post sometimes things I'm looking into, sometimes totally unrelated threads, such as the India moon landing, which I thought was fascinating. I'm now looking at solar energy, that kind of thing. Also, I share photos of Madrid on a
Yeah.
daily basis. There's that.
Yep. Yeah. And on LinkedIn as well. I think, I don't know whether you use that as frequently, but yeah.
No, I don't.
Okay. Fair enough. Well,
Not enough hours in the day.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Sincerely, thank you so much for doing this. As you just said, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I feel it was a great honor to have you here. I very much not only appreciate the depth of your knowledge across asset classes. To the audience, Noelle was just speaking about crypto for the most part today. She touched on some of her other macro knowledge, but you really, it's so difficult to, I think, have the depth of knowledge you have about across asset classes and to articulate it the way that you do. And I think it was actually some of the first time I read your work where it deeply resonated with me because it was distilled very well without being watered down. And I just was like, there's very few people that have that talent. So I appreciate what you're putting out there into the world, the nuance with which you talk about these topics and the depth of knowledge you have about them. So thank you very much.
To say that, Frank. Thank you.
That's my pleasure. And thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I hope we could do it again at some other point in the future. And yes, all the best with everything. And any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to share before we part?
Well, thank you so much for giving me this time to chat with you about these things. I think your background is fascinating. I'm really looking forward to seeing, how you, where you go with your educational efforts on this front. It's important, and the industry is lucky to have you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a great one, and we'll talk soon, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye
All
bye.
right. Bye-bye.